Van used to be a boring-ass office worker who lived in his office and went home only to sleep. However, one day, he wakes up as a 2-year-old boy and wonders where is he. He can't understand why his hands are so small, and he immediately runs around the room to see where he is. He goes straight to the window and gets mesmerized by the medieval castle and city he sees outside when suddenly, his maid Till comes running, thinking that Van is going to skydive without a parachute from the window. She helps him down and says that it is dangerous to stand at the window. And Van tells her that he was just mesmerized by the scenery, so he couldn't help but look. Till doesn't understand how Van is speaking high-level English at 2 years of age when he should be watching Skibbity Toilet and Fortnite Brainrot. Suddenly, Van recalls that he has faint memories of living in this place. He decides to do a quick recap and tells Till that his name is Van Nefertio and his father is Marquis Jalpa. He also remembers the names of his 3 elder brothers, and Till thinks that this is the second coming of Newton. Soon, it is breakfast time, and 3 maids surround Van to feed him because he is so damn cute. Van likes the attention he is getting because even though he has the body of a 2-year-old, he is actually a middle-aged perv inside. Suddenly, Van's father, Jalpa, asks his sons their plans for the day, and they tell him about the subjects they are going to study today. Next, Jalpa turns his attention to Van and asks what he will do. Van seriously answers that he knows nothing, so he will start from the basics and learn about the culture and history of their country. His brothers are dumbfounded on hearing him talk like that. But Jalpa starts laughing that he underestimated his youngest son. He thinks that Van will be talented in fire magic like him and his late wife and says that he has great hopes for him. Van already knows that there are different magic attributes in this world, but the nobles prefer the 4 basic elements that include fire, water, wind, and earth because they have high offensive power. All other types of magic attributes are seen as a disgrace, and all of Van's brothers have one of the 4 elements. Later that day, Van learns about their country from Till, and he gets excited to learn how many intelligent species are in their world. Till tells him that they have the usual roster of elves, dwarves, and others, but the rest of the maids tell her that a kid won't understand all that. Van tells Till not to pay attention to those ignorant bitches and begins asking her about magic tools instead. She tells him about magic crystals and rocks that can store magic and can be used to manufacture magic tools. While Van is learning just the basics, the old butler Esparta puts a bunch of books in front of him, saying that it is necessary to see how much he already knows before starting his education properly. Van is a bit intimidated by his mean-looking mustache, and tells Esparta that he can't read properly yet, but he knows a little bit of math. The butler starts with the very basics and asks him what 3 + 5 is. And when Van answers the question without counting on his fingers, the butler is so impressed that he decides to teach him personally. Van immediately knows it is going to be hell, and he is proven right as Esparta makes him study from dusk till dawn. But thanks to that, Van learns to read and write in just a couple of weeks. After that, he continues studying hard, and when he turns 4, it is time for his swordsmanship lessons to begin. His first training partner is Till, who can dodge like she is allergic to Van's wooden sword. He falls to his knees after failing to hit her even once, and Till teases him that she won against him. Van chases after her while pouting, but then the rest of the jealous maids hold Till down because she is insulting a noble. They tell Van to punish her for being rude, but he tells them that it is alright. However, the maids have a stick up their and they insist Van punish Till, so he just flicks her forehead and tells everyone that justice is served. For the next year, Van focuses on sword training, and by the age of 5, he can beat senior students because they are just kids with simple attack patterns, and he is a grown-ass man with a developed brain. The other students are impressed that Van is a genius even when it comes to combat, and they are even more overwhelmed when they see him treating them kindly even though they come from a lower social status. After that, Van takes a break when Dee, the deputy commander of the Knights, arrives there to check his hands. He finds that Van's hands are really smooth and there are no calluses, which makes him wonder how did he get so good without enough practice. Van tells him that he is too busy with his studies to train regularly, and Dee casually reveals that Esparta was ordered by the Marquis to make Van's lessons thrice as hard. This comes as a great shock to Van, but now he understands why his lessons were so long and so hard. Dee asks him if he is interested in learning sword fighting, because he will plead with the Marquis to reduce his lessons so that he can train to become the greatest swordsman of their country. Van tells him that he wants to focus on both his lessons and sword skills, and Dee decides to train him personally for the best results. He assures Van that he will go easy on him since he is just a kid, but that was a bigger lie than everything any politician has said. Dee's lessons are diabolically hard, But despite everything, Van enjoys the life after being reincarnated. Another year passes, and now the 6-year-old Van is known as a genius throughout his territory. However, he gets burnt out because his life revolves around books and swords. So one day, he tells Till that he wants to go outside. Soon, she takes him to the market along with 2 knights, and Van is thrilled to see different types of stores. He is curious about the grand building behind him, and Till tells him that it is the Merry Chamber of Commerce, which is a huge company with branches all over the country. Van realizes that this is just the Walmart of this world, when suddenly, he sees a man dragging a boy who looks really filthy and beaten up. The man tells Van to look away because it is not a show, and his knights get ready to remove the man's stupid head from his body for insulting a noble. Van stops them and asks the man why he is dragging that boy along, and he arrogantly replies that he is going to sell his son into slavery, and no one is going to stop him. This is the most shocking news for Van, but Till tells him that poor people in this world often sell their children into slavery to get some extra cash. Van is really appalled by this, but before he can interfere, a tanned mommy comes there, and she is really excited to see the youngest son of the Marquis. Till proudly affirms and shows off his family crest to the tanned mommy, who introduces herself as Rosalie from the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Van immediately asks Rosalie how much would the blue-haired boy be sold for, and she takes one quick glance at him and then asks his dad if he has any magic attribute. He replies that he has magic to steal things, and Rosalie says that the boy can only be sold for 3 large silver coins. This angers the old bastard, who starts kicking his son for being so worthless that his selling price is less than Sophie Rain's monthly OnlyFans subscription. Rosalie tells him to be kinder to his son, but he decides to take him to another shop to get a better price for him. Suddenly, Van offers to buy the boy for 5 large silver coins, and the bastard begrudgingly takes that offer. Van frees the boy and helps him get up, asking his name. The boy introduces himself as Calm as he takes Van's hand and stands up. Van tells him that he is free to go anywhere he wants to now, and Till asks him why he is letting the boy get away when he just bought him. Van replies that he just wanted to help him. He then learns that Calm has nowhere to go and decides to take him to the mansion. The knights tell Van that he can't take a boy of unknown origins to the mansion normally, and he needs to take him in as a slave. Being a modern guy who hates slavery, Van feels hurt by that sentence. But since Calm is okay with that, he decides to follow the idea. Rosalie interrupts him and says that they need to finalize the slave contract before that and asks both the boys to hold her hands. She then uses a spell to cast the contract spell on Calm, creating a tattoo on the back of his hand to show that he now serves Van. With that, Van takes Calm to the mansion, and he soon becomes a talented and loyal servant. One day, Calm comes to tell Van that Dee is looking for him, and Van gives him a cookie to lie that he is not here. Calm takes the bribe and then says that Dee already knows he is here, but Van tells him to cook up a story if he needs to. He then notices that Calm is not wearing the gloves he bought for him, and he declares that he wants to show off his tattoo to the world because it is proof that he serves Van. However, when Van says that he really wanted him to wear the gloves, Calm immediately changes his mind. Just then, Dee knocks on the door, and Calm goes outside to tell him that Van is not here. Dee says that a servant just saw him go inside, but Calm says that the guy must be doing heavy shrooms in broad daylight. Dee doubts that because he can see the cookie crumbs around Calm's mouth, but he quickly wipes them and says that he must also be doing shrooms to imagine things. Dee is impressed by the slave boy's audacity to talk back to him to protect his master, so he decides to train him in place of Van. 2 more years pass, and Van turns 8, which means it is time for his appraisal ceremony. Everyone has high hopes for him, and they want him to become their lord because he is not only a genius, but also treats everyone kindly. His father is also certain that Van will fire element magic like him, but all his hopes are replaced with disgust and disappointment when he learns that Van has talent in production magic. Jalma says that production magic is considered the worst kind of magic of nobles because it allows people to create swords and stuff using raw material and imagination. However, all of that can be done even without magic, and no one needs a noble who is just a glorified blacksmith. Jalma says that both he and his late wife are strong fire mages, and he can't accept that their son would have the weakest magic. He pulls out his sword and says that he should have pulled it out that night instead, but he will correct his mistakes now. Van is frozen in fear and doesn't know what to do, but before his dad can strike him, his eldest brother Mersha steps up to defend him. He suggests that they have a remote village in their territory that is still not developed, and they should let Van develop it. Jalma asks him to elaborate, and Mersha says that the nameless village has only 100 residents and they don't have anything going for them. There are strong monsters in the mountains to the north, and there is another noble's domain right next to them. On top of that, their rival kingdom, Yeleneta, is just beyond the village, and they only hold some military training exercises there. Jalma also agrees to the plan because the Nameless Village is a recently acquired territory, and they are not really loyal to their family yet, which makes sending a family member there a great decision. He praises Mersha for finding a use for the disgrace of their family and tells Van to leave for the village as soon as he can. When everyone has left, Mersha apologizes to Van for proposing to send him to such a harsh place, but he didn't want him to die at their father's hand. Van thanks him for saving his life, and Mersha promises to help him as much as he can in living a comfortable life at the village. Soon, Van starts packing his stuff, and Till is furious at the Marquis for sending him to a faraway place. But he tells her that he is actually looking forward to it because he will have a lot of free time there. As his luggage is loaded in carriages, Van thinks how his dad didn't allow him to take any knights along, and Mersha had to hire adventurers to guard him. On top of that, he was only allowed to take Calm with him at first. But thanks to his brother's intervention, now Till is also coming with him. Suddenly, Dee comes there and tells Van that he is coming along to complete his training. Van absolutely doesn't want that and says that his father has forbidden the knights to go with him. Dee replies that he hasn't gotten any news about that, and he even brings 2 of his knights with him. That is not all, as Esparta also comes there, telling Van that he has taken an early retirement from this mansion, and he will come along with him to continue teaching him. Once the carriage starts moving, Van feels a bit disappointed that he can't even use the family crest right now because his dad wants to send him away secretly. However, the entire city is gathered to bid him farewell because the knights are carrying huge banners saying Van is leaving. Van panics on seeing that and asks what they are doing, and the knights tell him that they are just following Dee's orders and they can't take down the banners until he says so. But he is asleep right now. With that, the entire city bids Van goodbye, and he promises to return to them someday. Later, Van takes a small twig in his hand and uses his production magic to turn it into a sword, which would require some sort of nuclear reaction to change wood into metal. But what do I know? Calm and Till are impressed by this, and Van says that he just wants to see if there is a good way to use his magic that is said to be useless. Till then tells him that they are near the village now, and Van is excited to see it. He tells Calm that if he doesn't like the life at the village, he can always return to the mansion. He is ready to nullify the slave contract and assures Calm that he can serve Mersha, who will treat him well. Calm immediately refuses, saying that he has already sworn to serve Van, and he will stay with him till the end. Van gets a bit taken aback by this because it sounds like a proposal, which is something he never got in his past life. Suddenly, the carriage rattles and comes to a stop, and Van opens the window to learn what is going on. A knight tells him that there is trouble ahead because the village is under attack by some bandits. Van immediately calls for a meeting, and Dee tells him that the bandits are used to fighting, so the villagers won't stand a chance against them. There are around 50 of them, and though the thick wooden wall is stopping the bandits from advancing, they are using arrows to attack the villagers beyond that. Dee tells Van that they should fight the bandits because they can drive them off if everyone works together. But the leader of the adventurers, Ortho, refuses to cooperate. He says that his mission is only to guard Van till he reaches the village, and he will not let his men rush into a battle where they are at a disadvantage. Dee argues that the villagers are the first citizens who will be placed under Van's rule, and they should fight to defend them. Ortho tells him that these ideals are befitting a knight like him, but he and his men are adventurers, so knight logic doesn't apply to them. Dee has no counter to that, so he asks Ortho to protect Van while he and the knights fight off the bandits. He knows that he might die in the process and asks the adventurers to take Van and run back to the city if needed. However, Esparta objects to this obviously stupid plan. He tells everyone that he may look like an ordinary servant, but he is actually an elemental mage, and he will help them win the battle. Everyone finds that hard to believe, but Esparta declares that he will create a wall and the adventurers should fire ranged attacks from behind it. That will distract the bandits, and Dee and the knights will flank them at the same time. Esparta thinks that once the bandits are attacked from all sides, they will flee. Van asks him if he plans to stay back and fight, and the old butler affirms, saying that he needs to keep attacking to make the bandits focus on him. Van says that it is dangerous and he can die, but Esparta wants to go out in a blaze of glory. Van tells him that he can't die in a place like this after faithfully serving his family for decades, and he doesn't want the knights to die either. He knows that if he loses Esparta and Dee now, he will fail to develop the village on his own, and his father will surely execute him for his failures. That is why Van thinks of an alternative and announces that he will act as the decoy. Everyone is shocked on hearing this, until immediately refuses to let that happen. She says that she will be the decoy instead, and Calm is ready to take her place. Van replies that he doesn't want to see anyone close to him die. That is why he will become the decoy. He plans to ride the carriage and attack the bandits head-on, giving others the chance to attack them from the sides. Dee thinks it is too risky, but Van reminds him that he trained under him, so he won't die so easily. And even if he dies, there can't be a greater end for a noble than to die for his people. He draws his sword and tells Dee to leave his body behind in case he perishes, because he doesn't want his family's name to be stained by his death. Van's words move Ortho, who recalls how he was not happy to take the job of guarding a noble's son because he thought that all of them are arrogant assholes. However, when Van came to greet him and even praised him for looking cool and badass, his opinion changed a bit. Now that he sees Van risking his life for his people, he decides not to be a coward and announces that he will fight with him. Van tells him that this is above his payroll, but Ortho replies that he can't be cool and badass if he lets a boy risk his life in his presence. His friends agree with him, and then Dee steps forward too, saying that he can't let his lord risk his life when he is still alive. Esparta agrees with him, saying that he will have to teach Van from the beginning if he thinks risking his life is a good strategy. He immediately comes up with a new plan and creates an earthen wall in seconds before telling the knights and adventurers to flank the bandits from both sides. Ortho and his heavyweight friend rush to one side while Dee and his men rush to the other. Meanwhile, the other adventurers begin firing arrows from behind the wall, taking down a few bandits and distracting the rest. Their leader orders them to target the people behind the wall first, but Dee rushes in just then and takes out a bunch of them at once. Ortho, the adventurers, and the knights join the action as well. And if that was not enough to make the bandits leave shit stains on their underwear, Dee begins emitting a menacing aura that makes them run away. The bandit leader realizes that they can't win like this, so he charges towards the walls to kill the people behind them. Ortho tries to alert his team, but they can't react in time, and the Cyclops wannabe gets ready to swing his heavy axe at the green-haired nerd. Van comes in clutch just then and taunts the bandit leader to get his attention. He nutmegs the big dude and then slashes his knees from behind, making him fall to the ground. Calm joins the fight too and leaps towards the bandit leader using his axe as a foothold and delivers a devastating finishing blow. Soon after that, all the remaining bandits are captured, with Van's forces suffering no losses. Ortho is happy that they achieved the best possible result and says that once they receive their payment, their work here will be done. But he is a bit curious about Van now. He sees great potential in him and asks his team if they want to stick around and see what he can make of this nameless village. Half of them tell him that there isn't enough money in the village for them, but his core team stays behind because they have also seen Van in action, and they believe he is not an ordinary boy. They want to invest in him because they are certain he will make it big someday, and then they can cash in all the loyalty points. Meanwhile, Till rattles Van for risking his life and tells him to let her dive into danger the next time. Just then, Dee and others come there and tell Van that the villagers have gathered at the gate. He decides to step into the village with pride and hope, but as he sees the village, he loses a bit of both because they look weak and desolate. The village chief welcomes Van and thanks him for saving his life, and the first question Van asks is if the village has been attacked before. The old man affirms, saying that they have been attacked many times this year already. Van asks the reason for that, and the chief replies that earlier, the village was part of another territory, and knights patrolled it regularly. Ever since they became part of the Ferdio family territory, no one has come to look after them. Van apologizes for that and says that his father doesn't recognize the value of the small villages yet. This pisses off the villagers, and the old chief asks if nobles think small villages are not worth protecting because they don't pay much tax. Van tells him it is pointless to blame anyone, and this makes the villagers even more angry. They say that a noble would never understand what they go through, but Van says that they are talking about the future of the village, and his anger is unnecessary here. He says that the nobles are responsible for the condition of the village, but the laws written by the founder of the kingdom are the main reason. He says that blaming the law won't change anything, and they need to do something else to protect the village. The first way is to produce something so valuable that the kingdom can't ignore them. The second way is to earn enough money to hire mercenaries to protect themselves. And the final way is to work on the village and make it better. A village baddie tells him that they also thought of that idea, but they have nothing at all. Van tells her that things are different now because they have a new lord, and he will do everything to defend the village. Well, the villagers don't trust him because he is a kid, but when Esparta and Dee step forward and introduce themselves as the former head butler and the vice commander of the Night Order, the villagers suddenly grow confident that their village is in the right hands. The chief asks Van if he has powerful elemental magic, and he immediately makes it clear that the best he can do is production magic. so they should expect combat strength from him. The villagers start sulking openly and Van's ego takes a hit. Just then, a villager asks him what they should do about taxes, because currently they find it hard to pay 30% of their income. Van decides to cut it down to 10% till the village is stable and all the villagers already start liking him. Next, Van says that they need to work on the village's defenses and asks Esparta if the earth wall he creates is long-lasting. The butler replies that it lasts only for a little time before the mana runs out, and then it becomes just a pile of soil. Van decides to build a sturdy wall later, but asks Esparta to create one with magic in the meantime. The old butler immediately creates a huge wall all around the village, and everyone is dumbfounded on seeing that. After that, Van says they need pitfalls and traps to slow down any bandits, and Dee asks him to leave that to him. Van then turns to the villagers, saying that they need to work together to rebuild the village, because then making it a successful place won't be a far-fetched dream. After that, Van goes to the forest to test out his production magic fully. He takes a small wooden log and uses his magic to fully feel every inch of it. He then splits the wood into very fine threads and then weaves them into a strong pattern, creating a solid pride cube. Till and Calm ask what it is, and Van tells them that it is a nanomaterial cube, which is really strong. He creates a bunch of them, and soon Ortho and his friends pass by. They get curious about the RGB cubes, and Ortho asks if he can try cutting one. He tosses a block in the air and then swings at it with full strength, but the block hits a nearby tree, and there is not a single scratch on it. Ortho is in disbelief because his strike could cut through stone, but the nanomaterial cube is still intact. After that, Van starts experimenting with his magic some more and keeps creating weapons and stuff till the sun starts to set. Till asks if he is not tired because production magic is said to consume a lot of mana, but Van feels completely fine. He wonders how much mana he has and casually creates a katana from wood, because who cares about science and conservation of energy and matter when you have magic? Calm's eyes start gleaming on seeing a new kind of sword, so Van gifts it to him, and then Till starts watching him with pleading eyes as well. Van gives her an axe, and Till is not happy at all because it has a creepy skull design that doesn't go well with her cute vibe. Later that night, as Till and Calm sleep, Van sits in front of the campfire, unable to rest. He feels tired after traveling and fighting, and also filthy because he has not had a bath in days. He thinks that his servants act fine, but they must also be tired, and he needs to get some basic facilities before working on the village. So, the next day, Van begins piling nano cubes in an open space to create a house out of them. The villagers gather around to see what he is doing, and even Van is not sure if he can create something so big. However, he focuses on the details and steps to build a house. First, he erects sturdy pillars that will support the weight of the ceiling, and then builds walls around them. Next, he builds more rooms with doors and windows, and then adds the roof to complete the building. With that, his house is complete in an instant, and no one can believe that Van built a whole mansion in a matter of seconds. But he is happy that he now has a house to live in comfortably. The entire village and Van's friends keep staring at the mansion with their jaws dropping to the ground, until says that his production magic is more suitable for governing a territory compared to elemental magic. Van acts humble, saying that offensive magic is still better overall because it allows a noble to protect his people. He feels that people feel better under a noble who can cast fireballs as compared to a glorified construction worker. Till and Calm disagree with him and say that they would rather live in his town than in his father's, but Van thinks they are just biased towards him. But Esparta believes they are right. He tells Van that in times of war, people might prefer to live under nobles with strong attack power, but in peaceful times, his ability is the best for their development. Dee, Ortho, and others also share the same sentiment, and they tell Van how unbelievable it is that he created a house faster than Usain Bolt runs 100 meters. Van tells them that if they bring him wood, he can build houses for them too, and both Dee and Ortho get fired up to collect wood and get their house made first. Well, they are not the only ones who want to get a new house, and the village chief timidly asks Van if they bring lumber, he can build houses for them too. The villagers start telling him how their houses are broken and not worth living in, and Van realizes that it is going to be really exhausting to renovate all of them. However, he doesn't want to disappoint his people, and it is true that their houses are waiting to crumble at any moment. He agrees to build houses for them if they bring him wood for that, and everyone is overjoyed on hearing this. Soon after that, Van creates an entire residential block at once, and people are still in awe at his skills. They say that it is one thing to have a huge mana pool, but Van also knows how to plan a proper layout for a settlement. Van starts flexing his knowledge about architecture and design and says that he used the grid layout in which each unit is made of 4 houses with wide streets connecting them. For now, he has made all the houses uniform so that there is no fighting, but he plans to renovate them eventually once they have sturdier raw material to use. The villagers are extremely grateful and offer what little crops they have to Van as a gift. After that, Van creates a public bathhouse next to his mansion because he wants to take a bath daily. But the villagers are also curious about it. Till and the green-haired mage Pluriel tell Van to take a bath with them, and he freaks out on hearing that and reminds them that he is a full-grown man already. The girls get to take a bath first, and Pluriel says that Van is unlike any other noble she has met, and he is really kind and wise. Till immediately starts yapping about how awesome her master is, and once she is finished telling her new friend about all that, it is the boys' turn to take a bath. Van and Calm go inside first, and Van notices that Calm is building up muscles after training regularly with Dee. Speak of the devil. Dee and the knights come to the bathhouse just then, and then the muscle-brained idiot starts swinging his heavy sword in the public bath. After the bath, Van goes to rest in his room and flops on the bed, thinking that he can finally rest after an exhausting day. The next morning, he wakes up to find that the knights have dug a trench around the village to protect it from raiders, and Van says that they need to fill it with water for best results. They also need water for drinking, farming, and the public bath. So Van decides their next priority will be to secure a stable source of water. He immediately scouts a nearby water body, and then Esparta creates a small canal in that direction. Dee and the other boys start widening and lengthening the canal, and Van follows behind them, using his magic to stabilize the walls and the bottom of the canal to make them leakage-proof. He notices that Dee is having the time of his life digging the hard soil, and Esparta says that he is quite active for a man in his early 40s. Calm and the knights are working their asses off as well, and Van thinks that it will take at least a week for the canal to be complete. However, he is determined to secure water for the village because once they have all the basic facilities, merchants will start visiting them, and he can improve everyone's standard of living. Well, Van seems to have overestimated the enthusiasm of his workers, and just by the end of the day, they are halfway to the village. Van says it is enough and tells them to stop, and Dee asks him what the issue is because he can keep going. Van tells him that not everyone has Big D energy like him, and Calm and others are trembling like their mom's favorite toy. Dee realizes that not everyone is built like him, so he agrees to take a break for the day, even though he still has enough stamina to finish the canal on his own. The canal is finished the next day, and everyone involved gathers at the river to witness its inauguration. Van tells Esparta to open the gate, and he shatters a stone plug to let water flow into the tunnel. Everyone applauds as they see water flowing steadily in the canal they created, and the villagers are astonished on seeing so much water at once. Soon, the water fills the trenches around the village, but Van fears that it might lead to flooding once the rains start. He decides to dig a lake behind the village so that they can avoid that, and Esparta says that it will also act as a reservoir for dry weather. Soon after that, Van and his friends build a lake behind the village, and the entire village gathers there to see it. They can't control their happiness on seeing it, and the village chief thanks Van because now they won't have to trek for a mile to get water for their families. A few days later, Van reinforces the village wall by adding bits of stone into mud and then turning them into concrete with his production magic. Everyone is sure that with such a sturdy wall, it won't even matter if the bandits attack them. But Van is not satisfied. He decides to make their defenses even stronger by installing ballistae on top of the wall and puts shields in front of them so they can attack the enemies while remaining safe from their ranged attacks. Van says they are just basic things, but everyone disagrees with him because they look really cool and impressive. They think that no one will dare to mess with their village now, and Esparta says that it is wrong to call this place a village because it is already starting to look like a fortress. Dee says that if Jalpa knew Van was capable of this, he would never have sent him away and would have even made him his successor immediately. Esparta disagrees, saying that Jalpa gives much more importance to combat abilities, and he would never have appreciated Van's talent fully. Dee argues that Van has more than enough combat strength, and he is probably stronger than anyone out there. Esparta argues back that Van's power is great for protecting people, but he can't conquer other territories. Dee takes this as a personal insult and says that war is more than just soldiers clashing swords with each other. Seeing that the two men are getting more serious than they should, Van asks them to stop. He says that arguing about talent and its use won't do them any good, and they need to try their best to live a better life with what they have got. Dee starts laughing on realizing his mistake, and he agrees with Van, saying that he will become a great ruler, no matter where he is sent. He confidently says that one day he might even have a domain that rivals his father's, but Van is more interested in breakfast because he is really hungry. He enjoys the breakfast. Till makes it for him, and she is glad that he likes it, because they are a bit short on ingredients. Van realizes it is a worrisome thing, and Esparta tells him that improving the village defense is a good idea, but they need to also worry about its income. They don't have any connections except the merchants who come here once per month. Van replies that he can take care of furniture and cutlery, and the villagers produce enough vegetables to sustain themselves, so they can manage just fine. Esparta wipes off the piece of omelet from his mustache as he tells Van that they don't have any seasonings here, and they also don't have the ingredients for the baked desserts that Van loves so much. Van is shocked to hear this and immediately turns towards Till, looking like she betrayed him. He decides to set up a special industry that will get this village all the money it needs. He asks his team to give him some ideas immediately, and Calm suggests that they can sell the nanocubes because they are a revolutionary material. Van refuses that idea immediately because only he can use them. Next, Till says they can hunt monsters for materials, but Van shoots down that idea as well because only the adventurers and the knights can do it. Esparta thinks that it is hard to find something special in this village, so Van decides to think hard about it. Later that day, he runs into the fatty from Ortho's group, who says that his servants seem to love him a lot because when he asked them to show what their weapons could do, they refuse to let the weapons be ruined by using them. Van is disappointed in both of them and says that weapons are meant to be used, and if they keep them stored up their ass, they won't help them when the time comes. Van encourages them to use their weapons, and the horizontally gifted adventurer pulls out a shield made from orc leather. He claims that it is really sturdy and can measure the power of their weapons and encourages them to attack him. Calm reluctantly agrees to do so and gently taps the shield with his katana. Mr. Plus-Sized asks him to put more force into it because that doesn't even count as an attack. But the very next moment, he notices a part of his shield falling to the ground. He can't believe that the shield he just got made is destroyed now. And on top of that, Van tells him that the sword looks like metal, but it is only made of wood. This makes Fatty cry really hard, but Van fixes his shield with his magic instantly. Just then, Ortho arrives there, and he asks Van if he wants to buy some valuable ores from them. Van is astonished to see him carry a cart full of rare minerals, and Ortho explains that the mountains near the village are full of ores and minerals, and they don't even have to go far to get them. He has got some iron, copper, and silver ore, and also a little bit of gold. However, the most valuable find is mithril ore, and Van goes crazy on seeing it. He wonders why no one else has found out the resources in the mountains before, and Ortho says that this place is just too far away and inconvenient for anyone to bother to look. After that, Van decides to work on the iron ore and turns it into a nanocube as well. Fatty gets excited on seeing it and asks Van if he can make swords with that. Van still feels bad about his shield, so he agrees to make one for him, and Fatty asks him to make a short sword and a long sword. Van works on the short sword first, carefully imagining all the details to make it durable, sharp, and also beautiful. Fatty is delighted on seeing the sword, and the rest of the adventurers swarm him to get a closer look, while Van creates a longsword in the same design. This makes the adventurers go cray-cray, and they ask Van if he can make swords for them too. He decides to make one each for them because they brought the ores, and then Pluriel tells him that the swords look like they can sell for a lot. Van thinks that if he can make swords out of mithril, they may sell for even more when Esparta arrives on the scene. He checks the mithril ore and says that it is very rare to find, but if the adventurers found it in the forest before even entering the mountain, it can only mean that there is a dungeon nearby. He says that if a dungeon is discovered here, the village will suddenly shoot into the limelight, and thousands of people will come here each day to explore the dungeon. While it will be a major boost for their economy, Van knows that they are not in the condition to support that many people. On top of that, he fears that they will be attacked by the rival country and even the neighboring nobles for the dungeon. Pluriel says that if a dungeon is found, Van's father will immediately dispatch the knights to protect it, and Van replies that his father has practically disowned him, so he will be sent somewhere else if this village becomes important. Pluriel now understands that Van wants to develop the village more and make it his permanent territory before discovering the dungeon and reporting it. And Ortho says that they will try not to go to the region where the dungeon can be. His friends also agree, and Van thanks them for keeping it a secret, even though they would profit more by being the ones to discover the dungeon. Soon after that, Van renovates the village once more with better quality materials, and Till is worried that he is overworking himself. Just then, a villager comes running and yells that a pack of armored lizard monsters is approaching the village. Van immediately orders everyone to get inside the walls and then locks the gates. The villagers are terrified of the monsters, but Van asks them to fight alongside him because together they can defeat any obstacle in their way. The villagers are motivated by Van's pep talk, and they swear they will fight till their last breath to protect the village. Van tells them to immediately head to the wall and position themselves behind the Abilitiy. Com tells him that Ortho and his party went out hunting, so they need someone to take command of the situation, and Van decides to head up with the rest of his citizens. However, Till grabs his arm with tears in her eyes, and Van may not be a simp, but he doesn't want to hurt her. He asks Dee to head up and relay the situation to him in real time. While he stays on the ground and issues orders, Dee accepts his order and rushes up to the wall, and the sight in front of him leaves him stunned. He tells Van that about 40 armored lizards are heading towards them, and they are about 8 meters tall, which is equal to 3 elephants standing on each other's shoulders in freedom units. Dee starts panicking on seeing this because even a group of veteran knights struggles to take down a single armored lizard. And right now, they have only a handful of trained fighters. Van commands him to load the iron arrows into the giant crossbows, and he immediately moves ahead to do that. His knights tell him that normal weapons don't work against the tough scales of the armored lizards, and Dee knows that too. He says that till now, he has won all the battles he has fought. But this time, he wants to trust his gut and let Van take the command. He orders everyone to load their ballista, and then commands them to fire. The arrows vanish as soon as they hit the lizards, and it takes a moment for Dee to realize that there is a huge hole wherever the arrows hit. The armored lizards hit by the arrows fall to the ground after a few seconds of inertia pushing their body forward. And just in the first volley, the villagers take down 10 of them. Dee is impressed by the quality of the weapons made by Van, and also by the villagers who for some reason can aim better than my Call of Duty teammates in ranked matches. He tells everyone to get ready for round 2, and the knights tell him that they only have 1 iron arrow left for each ballista. Dee tells them to load and fire nevertheless, and they manage to take down more armored lizards. However, half of the lizards are still left and they are out of ammo. Dee relays the message to Van, who begins to come up with a solution to the problem, when he suddenly remembers that Calm's wooden sword managed to cut through Fatty's high-spec shield. He thinks it might work against the armored lizards too, and tells Dee to use the wooden arrows. The knights think this is plain stupidity because wood is not going to make it through the lizard's skin that is tough like steel. Dee tells them to shut the hell up because Van has already proven them wrong multiple times, and he is going to trust what he says. He orders the villagers to load the wooden arrows and shoot, and even the wooden arrows manage to pierce through the lizards, even though they get stuck midway. Luckily, that is enough to hit their vital organs and kill them immediately, and now Dee knows that no one can beat them. He tells the villagers to load and fire once again, because tonight they are going to feast on lizard meat. The villagers follow his command and make it rain arrows on the armored lizards, wiping out whatever is left of them. Dee proudly declares their victory to Van and the rest of the villagers, who start cheering loudly. Till hugs Van tightly, and he is still trying to process that his wooden weapons actually worked against powerful monsters. Back on the top of the wall, the knights remark how no one from their side got injured, and they still have a lot of ammo left. Dee thinks that the battle was over so quickly that he feels a bit disappointed, but it just shows how OP Van's ability is. Soon after that, the villagers start processing the lizard corpses under the guidance of Ortho's party, who returned quite late. Ortho tells them to preserve the eyes, fangs, skin, and magic core for selling, while the meat is to be stored for eating. He says that usually processing armored lizards takes a lot of time and most of the meat rots before they can use it. But thanks to the knives Van has made, the work is really easy. Just then, Van arrives there and inspects the mountain of meat and decides to throw a huge party to celebrate their victory. At night, the festivities begin and people get to eat as much meat as they can. Ortho's group talks to Van and tells him that the weapons he made for them work really well. Dee overhears this and asks Van if he made weapons for the adventurers before him, and Ortho's group begins to show off their swords. Dee gets jealous on hearing this and asks Van to make a sword for him, and he is willing to write him a blank check for that. The other knights also want weapons made by Van, and he timidly tells them that he can't take any money from them, but he is a bit busy right now. He promises to make them new gear after the village affairs are sorted, and the knights are happy with that. After that, Ortho tells Van that usually, an armored lizard sells for 20 gold coins, but since most of the meat will rot, he can get about 8 gold coin per lizard. That is still a lot of money, and Van gets overwhelmed thinking about how he will use all that money. Isparta breaks some bad news to him, telling him that when a village earns more than 100 gold coins, they have to give half of it to the Marquis as taxes. Van feels like he lost his life's savings in a crypto scam on hearing this, and asks if there is any way they can commit tax fraud. Isparta tells him that they can't hide the sale of so much material, and Van loses all hope. However, he is more worried about his father discovering the importance of this village, because then he will exile him to some other faraway place. Suddenly, Esparta comes up with a solution, and says that they can compromise on the situation by reporting to Mercia instead of Jalpa. Van realizes that they can give the glory of defeating the lizards to his elder brother, which will cover up their actions and let them stay in this village for longer. The next day, two merchants come to the village and they get bamboozled on seeing the huge fortress-like wall in front of them. They start blaming each other for reading the Google Maps wrong and losing the path, when suddenly, Van appears on top of the gate and welcomes them to his village. The merchants are shocked because they recognize Van as the genius son of the Marquis, and wonder why is he in such a remote place. They introduce themselves as Bell and Rango from the Merry Chamber of Commerce, and Van lets them in. As soon as the merchant brothers reach the warehouse, their jaws drop halfway to the floor on seeing the materials harvested from the armored lizards. They find it hard to believe that such a tiny village hunted all these monsters, but Van just wants to know if they can buy all this stuff from them. The merchants immediately say yes and ask Van to wait for a month because they need to arrange for a whole team to evaluate and transport everything. Van agrees to that and asks them to take some meat for free because it is going to rot anyway since he can't create a fridge right now. He then asks the brothers to take a look at some weapons that are also for sale, and they are blown away by the quality. They immediately agree to Van's asking price without bargaining, and he asks them to promote them. The brothers hesitate to answer that question, and Van realizes that these noobs think they are pros who can monopolize the trade of his swords. He tells them that even if they try to keep it a secret, people will find out about the village because they can find out the route they take. The brothers are shocked to hear this, and Van tells them that there is another way they can make insane profit. They are eager to hear that, and he tells them to set up a shop in their village. The brothers immediately take up that offer and bow before Van to show their gratitude, and he tells them that they should build their shop right away, before they can even understand what he is talking about. Van creates the shop they always dreamt of opening, and tells them that he is looking forward to doing good business with them. Soon after that, Van gets two guests that he is not expecting at all. One of them is a noble girl nearly his age, and the other one is a badass night mommy guarding her. The night mommy is already judgmental and declares that she will find out if Van is really a genius or a poser. Meanwhile, Van is getting homework from Esparta, who tells him to plan a city for 10,000 people to live in, because at the rate they are developing this village, it will become a city in no time. He asks Van what kind of fortress city he wants, saying that square-shaped fortresses are most common. However, Van can't not be extra, and he says he wants to build a star-shaped fortress because that will force attackers to waste a lot of time trying to cover the defense points he will set up around the fortress. Esparta likes the idea and starts helping Van with it, when the redhead knight barges into the room, saying that an emissary from the neighboring Ferdinando County is here to see him. Van lets them in, and they turn out to be the same noble girl and the mommy knight. He greets them, and the mommy introduces herself as Mira, who became a viscountess after rising from the rank of a knight. The girl nervously introduces herself as Art, the youngest daughter of Count Ferdinando, and Van asks both of them to have a seat. Mira immediately asks Van why he thinks they are here, and he says they are here to assess him and win him over if he seems like a threat. She starts laughing on hearing that because Van is correct, and then says that Count Ferdinando thinks that Marquis Jalpa sent his genius son to rule this village because he wants to conquer his territory. However, Mira thinks that Van was sent here because he doesn't have elemental magic. Van decides to come clean and tells her that she is right about the elemental magic stuff, but he is not here to lead any sort of war, and he was just exiled by his father. Mira refuses to believe that after seeing how much Van has developed the village in a short time, and she believes that around 5,000 soldiers were sent with him to turn this village into a military base. Van breaks out into a laughter on hearing that, and then apologizes before telling Mira that he was kicked out of the family with nothing but his luggage and calm, and no one even came to see him off. Mira asks if she is hallucinating the butler and the deputy knight commander then, and Dee says that he came to complete Van's training of his own accord, and he has ignored messages from the knight commander to return to the city. Esparta also tells her that he retired and is now teaching Van as a hobby, and Till says that she wants to serve Van forever because he treats everyone kindly, no matter their social class. That still doesn't explain the rapid development, and Van decides to give his guests a demo because that will be faster. He takes them outside the village and asks Esparta to create an earthen wall so that he can turn it into a fortress-grade wall. Mira is impressed by the old butler's magic, but she says that the wall will crumble as soon as it loses mana. Van immediately uses his magic to transform the mud wall into solid concrete, and then uses some wood nanocubes to create a gate. Mira and Art are bamboozled on seeing this, and ask Van about his magical attribute. He replies that he can use production magic, which is considered the worst kind of magic, and that is why he was exiled here. Hearing that reminds Art of her own unfortunate life, and then Mira decides to get to her second agenda. She tells Van that she was sent here to offer Art's hand in marriage to him, and he understands that the Count wants to give him his daughter so that he doesn't try to conquer his territory. He tells Mira that a marriage is unnecessary because he doesn't want a conflict with anyone, and he is just developing the village because he wants to live a peaceful life here. Mira tells him that she initially wanted to prevent Art being engaged to the lord of a small nameless village because she would not find happiness in such a shabby place. But after seeing Van's potential and character, she supports their marriage. She starts praising his intelligence, charisma, and the willpower to turn hardships into challenges, and says that if it was legal, she would want to marry him herself. Van gets excited at the idea of having a mommy waifu, but unfortunately, he can only get Art right now. Mira turns to Art, asking if she wants to marry Van because she honestly can't find a better man. Art turns shy and says that Van is a good guy, but she has not thought about marriage yet. Van also tells her to take her time because it is the most important decision of her night, and Mira says that they are going to stay the night in the village so they can think then. Van is shocked to hear that they are staying over, but when Mira asks if he has a spare room in a mansion, he decides to build an inn for them instead. After that, they have dinner, and Van decides to know more about the girl who might become his future waifu. She tells him that she likes cute things like flowers and dolls, and Van asks if he can see the dolls she has. Art is glad that someone is taking an interest in her, and she happily agrees to show Van the dolls in her carriage. Later, Van walks the two ladies to the inn, and Mira leaves the two kids alone so that Art can tell Van that he is a nice guy before running to her room. Van then returns to his mansion, where Sparta tells him that since the Count sent his daughter to marry the lord of a nameless village, she probably isn't an elemental mage either. Van now realizes that Art was also exiled from her home, and he decides to let her stay in the village if she wants to, even if they don't get engaged. But that's where this video ends. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.